Welcome everyone to LLF's virtual festival this year. My name is Maha Khan Phillips, and I'm delighted to be in conversation today with Elif Shafak. Elif is a British Turkish novelist. She writes in both Turkish and in English and has published 18 books, 11 of which are novels. Her work has been translated into 54 languages. Her latest novel, 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the RSL Bodarci Prize and was chosen as Blackwell's Book of the Year. Her previous novel, The 40 Rules of Love, was chosen by the BBC to be among the 100 novels that shaped our world. She holds a PhD in political science, and she has taught at various universities in Turkey, in the UK, and the US, including St. Anne's College, Oxford University, where she is an honorary fellow. She is also a fellow and vice president of the Royal Society of Literature. She is a member of the We Forum Global Agenda Council on Creative Economy and a founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. An advocate for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and freedom of speech, she is a twice TED Global Speaker. She contributes to major publications around the world, and she was awarded the Medal of Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. In 2017, she was chosen by Politico as one of the 12 people who will give you a much-needed lift of the heart. She has judged numerous literary prizes and chaired the Wellcome Prize and is presently judging the PEN Nabokov Prize. Welcome, Elif.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you.
I wanted to start by asking you about all these different worlds that you inhabit. It's so interesting to me that you write fiction and nonfiction, that you're an academic, you're a human rights advocate. And I was curious about how these worlds might intersect with one another for you and whether they inform or influence your writing of fiction.
Thank you. I really appreciate this question because to me personally, it's so important to keep learning in life. You know, I see myself as a student of life, as a learner, and I think learning never stops. And I find it important that we learn from different disciplines. I am a novelist, a storyteller, and that's the center of everything that I do. So it's always about stories. That's always where I come back to. But that said, I think they're all connected. You know, my interests in philosophy, in history, and sometimes neuroscience, you know, fields that might seem to be completely unrelated. I think they are connected. And I cherish that kind of interdisciplinary learning. With regards to activism, I think that's in a way inevitable in the age we're living in. I think if you happen to be a storyteller who comes from a wounded democracy, from a land that is quite turbulent, such as Turkey, you don't have the luxury of saying, you know, I only want to talk about my fiction. I don't want to talk about anything else. I don't want to talk about what's happening outside the window. You have to speak up. So there are some core issues for me with regards to human rights, freedom of speech, women's rights, minority rights. And on these issues, I think each and every one of us has to now speak up louder, especially in the world we're living in.
And it's so interesting how many of those issues you bring to the fore in 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world, particularly in neuroscience, actually. So this is a novel that tells a story about Tequila Layla, and she is dead at the beginning of the book. I don't think that's a spoiler to say, but her consciousness is continuing for 10 minutes and 38 seconds, and that's a very important time frame. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your thinking around this book and where the idea came from?
Indeed, the book is a bit unusual in the sense that right away, actually on the very first page, we know that the main character is dead. Actually, the first two words are at the end. That's how the story starts. I became very interested in these scientific studies, research that has been done in numerous hospitals, universities. You know, I've read several papers, but particularly those carried out in Canada, show that after the heart has stopped beating, after that moment of death, the human brain can remain active for another few additional minutes. And sometimes that can go up to 10 minutes. And to me, that was a remarkable puzzle. So the heart has stopped, the person is dead, but their mind, their brain is still functioning. And if it is true that the part of the mind that is in charge of memory, long-term memory, is the last bit to shut down, then the question is, what do the dead remember? What happens in that limited amount of time within that person's mind? And that gave me the entire structure for the novel, as Tequila Layla, who has been brutally murdered and her body has been dumped in a garbage bin. We learned this right away on the first page or first section. But as she keeps remembering her past, minute by minute by minute, we travel to her story, into her story, but also I think into the story of a land, of a region, always told through the eyes of outcasts.
Yeah, I mean, she's such a compelling character. And what I loved about her is she's obviously someone who has gone through horrific things in her life, but she's not just a victim. She's a character who's so humanized and so courageous and so multifaceted. Was that important to you, that she wasn't just seen as a victim?
This was incredibly important to me. I come from a country that is deeply patriarchal, deeply sexist, and it's not easy for young girls or young boys, because I think patriarchy makes men and women unhappy. So maybe we'll talk about that. But particularly as I followed Layla's story, coming from a very conservative background, very patriarchal upbringing, trying to find her feet, trying to find her individuality, and not being allowed to do any of this. Maybe we should also mention that she grows up in a family that is polygamous. So she grows up with two mothers, two women in the house, without quite knowing which one of these two women is her biological mother. So there are silences in the family. Polygamy in Turkey is illegal, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Especially in the period that I write about, it could happen. And there are many, many personal stories, tragic stories like that. So I wanted to follow 1950s, 60s, 70s. For me, that historical background was also very important. But coming back to your emphasis, I really never ever saw her as a passive victim. For me, none of these characters are passive victims. They have gone through incredibly tough things, and yet at the same time, there's resilience, there's strength in their very existence. So I wanted to bring that out as well.
I think for me, reading the book, what was remarkable is there are some very harrowing scenes and there's a lot of difficult moments. But what I was left with was this lingering sense of love. And that was because of these friendships. This book is so much about friendships. And tell us about these characters that you created, Layla's friends, and how important they were to the story.
This question really means a lot to me, because I have heard from numerous people who have read the book that even though this is a book that deals with dark subjects, difficult subjects, that nonetheless they found it very uplifting. And when I hear that, it makes me happy, because that too was my experience. And like you, I also think this is a book about love. It's a book about sisterhood. It's a book about friendships. So that bond that human beings can create, the way human beings can connect despite everything, despite their circumstances, this is something I wholeheartedly believe in. But I also think in countries where democracy is bruised or broken or non-existent, it is very difficult to be different. If you look different in the eyes of others, it could be the color of your skin, it could be your sexual identity, it could be your physical appearance, whatever reason, if you are different in the eyes of the general public or the authorities, then life is going to be difficult. So lots of people experience that difficulty, people who are being pushed to the periphery, people who are on the margins of the society, people whose voices we do not hear and we do not read about in our mainstream newspapers, and yet they exist. So for me, it was incredibly important to, in a way, give more voice to people who have been silenced and make the invisible a bit more visible. And I believe, especially for people along that periphery, people who have been mistreated and pushed to the margins of the society, especially for those communities, sisterhood and friendship are even more important, because that keeps you going. You know, that everything else makes you think that there's something wrong with you. Everything else makes you think that you are alone on your own. And yet through friends, you realize you're not alone. And many people feel the same way. So that kind of bonding, emotional bonding, I think is especially important in countries where there is no democracy or broken democracy.
And I love the way you describe your blood family and your water family, and the fact that some of us may not be lucky with our blood families, but we get to choose the friendship water family that is just as bonding. But I also think it's fantastic the way you bring in that idea of marginalization when you describe the cemetery of the companionless. And it was amazing to see that that was a real cemetery. And also it gave me goosebumps because we have in Karachi the graveyard of the unknown, which is looks quite similar and is set up in a similar way. But were you aware of the cemetery before you started writing, or was it something that maybe propelled some of the story?
I was aware of this cemetery before I started writing the novel. Actually, I visited this place long time ago, and I've never forgotten what I saw. It stayed with me. And ever since then, I've been doing some research on the side, trying to find more information as to who are these people who have been buried here. And when I say buried, we need to understand that we're not talking about a proper burial. We're not talking about a proper funeral. There are no rituals. It's almost like people are dumped there without any personal information. And in Turkish, what we call the cemetery Kimsesizler Mezarlığı, which means cemetery of the companionless, people who don't have a companion in life. And there was a part of me that could not accept that, because if you focus on each and every story, they had companions, they had friends, they were loved, but we don't know their stories. We don't know their stories because they became numbers in that cemetery. So the thing about this particular graveyard is that, unlike any other graveyard, there are no marble tombstones, no visitors, no names or surnames, no personal information, on the tombstones, just a wooden placard with a number scribbled on it. And sometimes because of the snow or rain, when the number disappears, everything disappears. So as I kept doing research, I realized most of the people who have been buried here have been shunned by their families or by their communities. Among them, there are some sex workers. Among them, there are also suicides, people who committed suicide and were denied a proper funeral. There are abandoned babies who were found in public spaces and buried here. There's also lots of LGBTQ members who have been, again, rejected by their families or unloved. And there's a growing number of refugees. Every day in our newspapers, we read about an Afghan refugee or a Syrian refugee who might have lost their lives while trying to come to Europe. Where are the bodies taken? The bodies are taken to the Cemetery of Companionless in Istanbul. So it's an incredibly sad place and a very unusual place. And I think my instinct as a writer was to try to reverse that process, because it's a graveyard in which actual human beings are dehumanized. And I wanted to rehumanize someone who had been dehumanized.
Well, I think you did that very well. Just one last question about this novel particularly. So the notion of time is so important in this novel, those 10 minutes and 38 seconds. Was that difficult to structure, or was that straightforward because you sort of had this divided timeline that you had to work with?
It was incredibly difficult, actually, because I knew Tequila Layla had only 10 minutes 38 seconds in this world left, and that means you have to compress her entire life. What does she remember? Does she remember the bad things or the good things? And how does she remember? And I don't think memory walks in a linear way. It's much more chaotic than that. And I wanted to reflect that nature of how our memories work. But most importantly, I had so much more to write, and I had to let go. I had to delete as much as I wrote for this book, because when you have a very limited amount of time, you have to let go of so many memories. That part was challenging, and at the same time, maybe it made me realize as an author the value, the importance of each and every memory. So it is an interesting, almost spiritual exercise for me, writing with that limited format and trying to be truthful to her story within that framework.
It's so difficult to let go of the writing that you love and
Yes.
and that you have to make work. But thank you. And I also wanted to talk to you about women's lives in your work. I mean, you talk about and you look at the challenges and complexities that women face, and you give voice to so many women. And is that important to you, to examine the sort of lived experiences of women and to give them a voice?
It is incredibly important for me. Throughout my own journey, both in academia and outside of academia, I've always tried to learn from women's studies, gender studies. That interdisciplinary work is something that really broadened my way of thinking. But I have to also tell you that this is more personal for me. I myself was raised by two women, by my mother and my grandmother, mostly by a single working mom, but also a grandma who raised me until I was 10 years old, 11 years old. And they were very different women. My mom is very westernized, very modern, very rational, very urban, secular. Grandma was more spiritual, less educated because she had been denied a proper education just because she was a girl. And at the same time, she was a very wise woman who very much supported women's education and respected their individuality. Someone might say she was very superstitious as well. So I grew up with her stories, observing her, but most importantly, observing the solidarity, the sisterhood between these two women. And I honestly, profoundly think, passionately think, believe that if women support each other, the impact of that goes beyond generations. Because my grandmother supported my mother at a time when she needed support, as coming back from a bad marriage, and allowed her daughter to go back to university, complete her education. Because of that support, not only my mom's life changed, but also so did mine and probably my children. So we women need to support each other. The impact of that goes beyond our own limited lives.
And it's interesting, the point you made about patriarchy being bad for women, but also bad for men. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what you meant?
Yeah, and I think this is something we don't talk about enough, but we have to. And maybe non-Western feminists can understand this better. And this is a point that we need to raise more loudly, because we do know that in countries that are more enclosed or more conservative, the codes of honor, the codes of masculinity are not easy for young men at all. If you, for whatever reason, you do not conform to the dominant form of masculinity, as a man, you can be bullied, you can be ridiculed, you can be shunned, and sometimes women too can take part in that discrimination. So it's incredibly complex. For one of my earlier novels, which is called Honor, I studied honor killings and honor crimes, especially in Turkey, but also throughout the Middle East. And it's just heartbreaking to see 15-year-old, 16-year-old boys sometimes manipulated by family councils, these horrific codes which have nothing to do with honor. Honor has nothing to do with this, but this is unfortunately a part of the culture that we need to face, challenge, and change immediately. So I want to talk about all these things, and I want to talk about how masculinity makes that dominant form of masculinity, makes also young men, makes them feel trapped and makes them be unhappy. And that's why I believe a women's movement should be incredibly diverse. Women's movement should be open to women from all backgrounds, also go hand in hand with the rights of LGBTQ minorities, and at the same time, go hand in hand with young men or many men from different backgrounds who are not happy with this system at all. So we need to broaden the narrative rather than just go into our own small tribes.
It's so true. It's so true. And I remember my mother once saying to me, you know, you always think, Maha, that you have to convince men about something, but first you have to convince the women, because there are so many women who are also part of that system. So no, that's very true. I also wanted to talk to you about, or ask you about, mysticism and Sufism, and how you became interested in mysticism. And obviously you write about it, particularly in the 40 Rules of Love. Is that something that you've always been interested in?
I think it's also part of seeing myself as a learner. I have been interested in mysticism for a long time, actually, since my early student years. And I love reading and thinking about this subject. And nonetheless, I'm also aware that it's such an infinite subject that the more you read, the less you know. It shows you what you don't know. So I have no claims. And I'm someone who is interested in the dialogue between faith and doubt. I think doubt is precious. And when we don't have doubt about anything in life, that's a dogma, and dogmas are dangerous. So I don't want to get rid of doubt. And yet at the same time, I'm someone who's interested in faith. But primarily, I'm interested in whether they can speak to each other, whether they can challenge each other, whether they can dance together. So I don't like certainties. People who are very certain of their truths always scare me, to be honest. I don't understand. If life is more fluid, if our main element is water, if everything is changing constantly, isn't it better to be a student rather than claim that we certainly know the truth? So all I'm trying to say is certainty, the absolutism of certainty, whether it comes from religiosity or atheism, is something that I don't feel very comfortable with. But I am closer, I think, to people who can say, I don't know, I'm still learning. And I think especially in this age, we have forgotten to say, I don't know. When was the last time we ever said, I don't know? If we don't know the answer to anything, we can just Google it. And in the next 5 minutes, we think we know something about it. But I think I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think they're completely different things. So the reason why I'm interested in mysticism is also because it is interested in wisdom, the inner meaning, not the surface. And I think when you are interested in wisdom, you don't judge people. You don't think you know better than other people. You try to understand people. And there's a kind of humility that I really think we need to remember in this age.
It's so interesting because, as you say, we live in a world now where people have so many certainties about so many things, and social media in some ways is an echo chamber. And you address some of that in How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. Do you think that we can move forwards from this, or what do you think? How do you think this will all play out? This sort of age of certainty. How do we move forward from it?
Yeah, it is worrying because on the one hand, understandably, so many of us, we're dealing with lots of negative emotions, whether it's anxiety, fear, uncertainty. Sometimes we feel frustrated. We think nothing is changing or going in the right direction. And we need to talk about all these seemingly negative emotions. I am not scared of emotions. If there's one emotion that I find incredibly dangerous, that is the lack of all emotions, which is numbness, which is indifference. The moment we become disconnected from each other, the moment we stop caring about each other's pain, each other's stories, that is a very, very dangerous threshold for humanity. But everything else, whether it's anger, anxiety, we need to understand where they're coming from and try to transform it into something more positive, more constructive. And we need to be able to talk, but also learn to listen to each other. And that's the paradox of our age, because on the one hand, thanks to digital technologies, it feels like each and every one of us has a voice now. But at the same time, the number of people who are saying over and over that they're feeling voiceless has increased, both East and West. So how is it possible that in the age of social media and digital technologies, when we were each given a voice, more and more people are feeling voiceless? And I wanted to think about that. I think it's important to be listeners in life, good listeners, to learn from each other. If all our friends think like us, dress like us, vote like us, speak like us, it means we are surrounded by our own mirror image. And we don't learn from mirror images. We don't learn from the echoes of our own voice, because that's just a repetition. In life, we learn from differences. So to me, diversity is important. Diversity is precious. I'm aware that it's not easy, but I think it's a goal worth defending: multiplicity, diversity, inclusion. And at the same time, I am worried about inequality, because I think inequalities are making things much worse. So people are always saying, when are we going to go back to the normal after the pandemic? But I think it's going to be a completely different world. So we have to build it better, not try to go back to what it used to be before the pandemic.
And it was interesting to read that you grew up in a variety of different countries, and you described yourself as a spiritual and physical nomad. And how did that this sense of diversity and this sense of the other, how did that sort of evolve and affect and impact your writing?
I think it left a huge impact on me, all these journeys. I was born in Strasbourg in France to Turkish parents. And the first house that I was brought to was full of immigrants, leftist students, smoking lots of gluas, talking about big ideals. When my parents' marriage came to an end, my father stayed in France. My mother brought me to Turkey, because for her it was motherland. For me, it was a completely new country. And thereafter, I was in Ankara. Later on, because of my mother's profession, after I was 11 years old, I spent some time in Madrid, Spain, some time in Amman, back to Ankara. In my early 20s, I came to Istanbul because I loved Istanbul. I lived many, many years in Istanbul. I wrote so many of my books in Istanbul, and I fell in love with Istanbul. And I still carry Istanbul with me. But I also felt suffocated in Istanbul. So then I moved to Boston, Michigan, Arizona, back to Istanbul, and then London. And in that regard, it has always been a bit peripatetic. It has always been a bit nomadic. And I thought literature was the only thing that, kept my pieces together. But coming back to your important question, I think we're always learning more when we meet people who are different than us, who come from different stories, maybe different backgrounds. Those cosmopolitan encounters are incredibly precious. That said, we can't always travel, but we can travel through books with stories. When we read a novel, we can travel to another century, another place. So we go beyond the confines of our limited identity. That transcendental experience that comes with literature, I think, is incredibly precious. So in that regard, for me, literature is not necessarily autobiographical. I'm interested in becoming someone else and then looking at the world through their eyes, and then someone else. I think we need that cognitive flexibility. And so as much as I've learned from journeys, I think I've learned much more from books.
So I just wanted to ask you about Turkey and about Istanbul. So you've been an outspoken critic of the regime. You've also had some run-ins with the regime. So you were tried in absentia for something you'd written in a novel in 2006 for insulting Turkishness. And then even as you write about and try and highlight issues around sexual violence, the authorities decided to investigate you for writing about sexual violence. Has this impacted what you feel you can write, or has it made you more determined to raise your voice?
It's a tough question, to be honest, because when I think about politics and politicians in Turkey, I feel demoralized. And there's a pessimism that comes over. But when I think about the people of Turkey, whether it's women or young people, students, minorities, Kurds, Turks, Alevis, people of all backgrounds, I feel much more hopeful because they're amazing. And people read and people share books and people love stories. So it's a mixed feeling. And I find it very sad that in a country where women are killed every day, where in a country where in the last 10 years we have seen an escalation in violence against women, the percentage of increase in Turkey is 1,400%. 1,400% increase in violence against women in the last 10 to 12 years. So obviously we have a massive problem in front of us. And even though these are not easy subjects, we have to talk. We can't pretend it's not happening. But instead of helping women and children who are facing abuse, instead of changing the patriarchal laws, instead of opening shelters for women who have nowhere to go, the fact that authorities are either prosecuting or investigating writers, novelists who deal with these subjects is to me just unbelievable, unacceptable. Of course, writers have to deal with the issues that hurt their societies. This has always been the case throughout world literature. But again, it comes back to the lack of democracy. In a place where there is no democracy, whatever you write will offend someone. This could be a political issue. I was put on trial in 2006, as you mentioned, for writing The Bastard of Istanbul. And that's a book that talks about the Armenian genocide, which is a very, very difficult subject to talk about in Turkey. It is one of the biggest silences. In my opinion, it is better to understand the past, not to be stuck in the past, but to respect, to recognize rather than to try to gloss over. I find it very interesting that Turkey is a country that has a rich history, but at the same time, a collective amnesia, widespread amnesia. So rich history doesn't mean strong memory. We have a rich history, but very, weak memory. So again, those silences are important, but it's not about political or politicized themes such as how to interpret history. Even when you write about gender, sexuality, you can again offend someone if in that country there is no respect for diversity and there's no democracy. So it's difficult to be a writer. It's difficult to be a novelist in such a context. But at the same time, you also know that books matter, stories matter, stories change us. I know that because it happened to me. Stories changed me. I learned so much myself. So when a writer sends me a letter and says, I read your book and it really stayed with me, that letter stays with me too. And that's why I think being a Turkish writer is a bit like being slapped on one cheek and kissed on the other cheek at the same time. You feel a bit dizzy. You do get lots of love from your readers, which is incredibly precious. But at the same time, this lack of oxygen because of the political circumstances and the lack of freedom of speech makes the life of an artist very difficult.
And particularly now, the rising censorship and, voices are being silenced, whether it's journalism or writing. That must be a very fraught time for a lot of people, for a lot of artists and writers. And
it is indeed. And also, we need to understand that Turkey is now the biggest jailer of journalists. Sorry. Can I start again?
Of course.
It is very difficult, and we need to understand that Turkey became the biggest jailer of journalists in the world. In the past, it used to be Russia, it used to be China, but the numbers in Turkey have surpassed even those sad records. So we need to talk. Many people, so many academics have lost their jobs just because they signed a peace petition. This week, students at one of the leading universities, just for putting up LGBTQ flags, they have been targeted by authorities. So, and some of them have been detained, arrested. So there's a lot going on, and we need to speak out about all these issues. Art cannot flourish, freedom cannot flourish if there's no democracy. I think not only in countries like Turkey, but across the world, especially after 2016, including here in the UK, more and more people realize that democracy is much more fragile. it's much more delicate than we initially assumed. It's a delicate system of ecosystem of checks and balances. And it doesn't only require a ballot box. It doesn't only mean, voting every few years. You need more than that for a democracy to survive. You need rule of law, definitely freedom of speech, a free media, women's rights, minority rights, checks and balances. Together with all these components, a democracy can survive. So I think the entire world is now more and more realizing that for democracies to thrive, we need engaged citizens. Whatever we do in life, I think without being partisan, without going to extremes, but to speak up, to be involved, to care about inequalities, I think it's important for every citizen in this age.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I wanted to talk to you about the world of identity politics in fiction. And it's something that you've talked about in the past, and I think it's really interesting. So the way stories are read and the way they're being reviewed. You've talked about the fact that many, particularly non-Western writers, feel that they are sort of having to write certain types of stories. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant?
There's a lot of identity politics in the publishing world that I am not happy with, and I do talk about, and I think we need to question. And it usually affects us, those of us who come from the non-Western world, and those of us who happen to be women, for instance, affects us even more. But let me give you maybe an example. Again, if you happen to be a women writer from Pakistan, a women writer from Turkey or Afghanistan, you are expected to write the stories of women in your land, more realistic stories. And I am not content with that. Of course, if that's what a writer wants to do, definitely, I will always be interested in reading that work. And I myself have written about issues that are related to my motherland. But that doesn't mean in my next novel, I have to do the same. Maybe in one of your novels, you're going to write about a story that takes place in Norway or something completely different that doesn't seem to be part of your identity at first glance. So it's much more difficult for us non-Western women writers to question the identity politics within the publishing industry. Whereas for many Western authors, there's a bit more leeway, there's a bit more flexibility, freedom. And this is something that I have noticed over the years and I've been questioning. Also, if you happen to be a woman writer, again, especially from a Muslim majority country, you will always see always the same symbolism put on your book covers, book jackets. So again, which I have nothing against, which I don't have anything against, but all I'm saying, why this repetition? Why are they trying to put us into boxes? That pigeonholing is something that I'm not comfortable with because, again, I think art is about freedom. So there's this idea as if a writer from Pakistan, as if a writer from Afghanistan or Turkey cannot, for instance, produce avant-garde fiction or experimental fiction or science fiction. We have to write realistic stories of our lands. That's the mold that I want to break and question.
It's a really interesting topic, and the amount of friends I have who are writers from Pakistan who at one point or another have been shown covers of their work with sort of women with the henna, and it's incredible.
Same. I mean, either a mosque or a veil or the hands with henna, constantly the same symbolism. Of course, these are parts of our culture, and yet our cultures are at the same time have many more symbols, many more colors. So plural stories to bring out this multiplicity that exists within our cultures, but also in the mind of a writer. So I think, it comes back to defending multiplicity. If I may diverge a little bit, I think as human beings, we all have multiple belongings. We're not just one single identity. Of course, I'm an Istanbulite, but I also think I'm very attached to the Balkans. There are many elements in my soul from the Middle East. I do feel I've become a Londoner after all these years. I've become a British citizen. And despite because of this Brexit saga, what politicians have been telling us in this country, I would like to see myself as a citizen of the world. That doesn't mean you're a citizen of nowhere. It doesn't mean you're just floating in the air aimlessly, you know. So I think in this age, especially when we're pushed into boxes, it is all the more important to defend multiple belongings.
I think that was the most asinine comment I've ever heard, that if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. That just, I totally agree with you. Yeah. And let me ask you a bit about your approach to writing. So you write in Turkish and in English, which is remarkable. Is there a particular voice or language that lends itself to one or the other?
It's a journey for me. It's a commute, you know. I love the commute between the two languages, and as you can hear in my voice, I'm an immigrant. I'm a late comer. You know, English for me is an acquired language. Whether it's my pronunciation or the things that I have failed to express, I know that feeling that so many immigrants have, because I did not grow up bilingual. You know, I started learning English later on in life. And that means there will always be a gap between my mind and my tongue. In a way, the mind runs faster. The tongue is trying to catch up. And you're very much aware of not what you're capable of saying, but what you can't say. And that is frustrating. But at the same time, it pushes us, and it maybe teaches us to pay more attention to each and every language, to each and every word. Maybe notice the nuances that sometimes natives do not notice because they take it for granted. So I love paying attention to language. And over the years, I think I noticed if my writing has melancholy or longing or sorrow, I find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But at the same time, if my writing has humor is incredibly important for me, or irony or satire, I find these things much easier to express in English. So both humor and sorrow are important, I think, in my writing, and I learn from that commute. But again, this was not an easy subject in Turkey, because when I first started writing in English, people said, okay, she's not a Turkish writer anymore. She's not one of us anymore because she abandoned her mother tongue. Again, this either-or mentality, whereas I think we're living in an age in which many of us, more and more of us, are dreaming in more than one language. And if we can dream in more than one language, why can't we write fiction in more than one language? So all those nationalistic patterns that belong to another era, to the 19th century, why do I have to confine myself in that way?
I don't think you do. I think that's fantastic. And do you have a writing process? Is it sort of something that you do religiously? Is it something that you approach in a particular way, or do you write everywhere and anytime?
It's a bit more disorganized in the sense that I don't write every day at the same hour, and I think it's a bit of a privilege for, you know, middle class, upper class, white male writers. They're very fond of, some of them, not all of them, of course, but some of them are very fond of their precise schedules. But I think all the rest of us, we write whenever we can, right? We try to carve out a space, some time for ourselves. So sometimes it's in the day. If I can't write during the day, then I write at night. But every day I read. Every day I take notes. Every day I work. That never changes. Sometimes I work at home, sometimes outside in crowded cafes, sometimes in train stations, you know, however life flows. At the same time, I love to listen to music. I don't like silence much. Maybe that's the impact of Istanbul on me. When it's too silent around, I panic a little bit. So there's always some kind of music in the background for me when I'm writing. Usually I put on my headphones. I listen to
you're a heavy metal fan.
Yeah, I listen to different genres of heavy metal, which sometimes surprises people. They don't expect maybe someone of my age or background to love heavy metal, but I've always been a metal fan.
And if you talk about sort of the types of things that, you know, you're reading every day, are there particular writers who have inspired you in your own journey?
A lot, so many, and not only fiction writers, non-fiction as well. You know, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, I've also learned so much from political philosophy, history, poetry. I love reading poetry. I read lots of novels, mostly novels, but at the same time, I like to combine fiction and nonfiction. And when a reader says to me, I don't read fiction, I don't have time for fiction, I read important stuff because I want to understand the world. Sometimes people say such things. I feel sad because primarily because everything is connected. Why do we compartmentalize like that? But secondly, inside fiction, there's everything. In a novel, there is history, there is politics, there is, neuroscience, there is existential questions. But most importantly, there's empathy. And I don't know a single human being in this world who doesn't need empathy. I don't know a single human being who doesn't need emotional intelligence. Whether you're a dentist or a designer or an engineer, someone who might seem to have nothing to do with literature, nonetheless, we all need emotional intelligence. And that's what stories give us, the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of another person, that cognitive flexibility and emotional intelligence. So there's a lot in the world of novels. And I read both from the East and the West. I try not to read only Eurocentric literature, but across the world. That's important to me.
I mean, I think that should be important more widely. And just personally, I'm looking at my 14-year-old now's curriculum of what he's reading. And there's a lot of, Shakespeare and white men on the curriculum. And I think that's such a shame.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. We need more diversity in our curriculum. And when we need this debate, actually, not only when we talk about history and memory, but also what we're learning at school today, how we're learning, and where are the silences? What are the voices that we haven't heard yet? I think that's incredibly important.
And do you think COVID has been a catalyst? I mean, I keep hearing that people are reading more. Do you think that this might be for fiction an interesting time?
It is a very interesting time. Actually, there are two things that I find remarkable. On the one hand, we live in an age of speed when everything is consumed fast and we don't have, patience anymore, and our attention span is becoming shorter and shorter. But at the same time, people are reading novels. So that seems like a paradox. And as you said, with COVID, with the pandemic, it increased. Book sales have increased, which is maybe the one silver lining we can talk about in an otherwise very disturbing and dark time. But why is it like that? And I think it's because our need for stories is so existential, it's so essential. Sometimes the format can change, whether it's an ebook or a print copy, that doesn't matter that much. What matters is that our need for stories is here. And maybe the faster the world flows, the bigger our uncertainties, the deeper our need for stories and storytelling. So I think that's going to be with us, and that's something very universal.
And I hope you're right. I don't know if it's early days or if you can tell us what you're working on now.
It's a bit early. I'm working on a new novel. Actually, it's going to come out at the end of the summer, in August. And it's called The Island of Missing Trees. I find it a little bit too difficult to talk about it only because I'm just surfacing from a very long writing process. I have this pendulum. When I write, I become very immersed, and that becomes the center of my life. I'm not a very normal human being when I'm writing. When the book is over, then I try to get out of that zone, become a more social human being, again, become the learner of life, do things that have nothing to do with writing, just learn to bake a bread, things like that. But that pendulum always moves. So I'm just surfacing from a very long writing process. Hopefully next time we talk, I'll be able to
a bit unfair to ask you about it now, but really looking forward to it when it's out in the world.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Maybe I can briefly say it's a book in which memory, family traumas, finding our voice, and in individuality is incredibly important. And it's a love story. It's a love story that seems impossible at first glance.
Wow, That sounds fantastic. I look forward to it.
Thank
And
you.
since we have a bit more time, I'm so interested in this relationship between you and your grandmother and your mother. Your grandmother sounds a bit like my grandmother, actually. But
Really?
but tell me a little bit more about her. Tell us, because she's obviously someone who had a huge impact in your life, but she was a healer as well. Is that right?
Yeah, she was a healer. I mean, I find it a bit difficult to talk about these subjects because it sounds so irrational. I'm very much aware of that. And yet at the same time, I have enormous respect for oral culture. You know, I've never looked down upon oral culture. Sometimes intellectuals can see, at least where I come from, I've observed many intellectuals kind of belittling oral culture or traditions or superstitions and seeing it as a domain of usually women. And that has never been my approach. And in my writing, I would love to, as much as I can, try to bridge written culture and oral culture. So when I think of my grandmother, I don't necessarily think of her as her individual knowledge, but also the knowledge that she carried from previous generations. That was very important for her. Like, you don't possess knowledge, you take it and then you pass it on. It's not yours. That was her approach to knowledge, which fascinated me, you know, which left an impact on me. And that's why I respect oral culture so much, you know, and there's so much wisdom there. Her house was full of magic. You know, she was a woman who would read coffee cups and melt lead to ward off the evil eye. She was a healer in her own way. People would come to her. People with skin diseases would come to her. People with sometimes anxiety issues would come to her, and she would heal them. And I would watch from a corner as a young girl, you know, this world full of women and words. I think from her, I learned that words are important. So whether it's the written word or the spoken word, I'm aware of the power of words.
She sounds amazing. So my grandmother was also very superstitious, but she was also quite academic. So she translated Pride and Prejudice into Urdu, for example. But she would
Yeah,
also tell me not to do certain things because, you know, I might disturb the
that's
spirits.
amazing.
Yeah. So I think these women in our lives are so important, and they
Yeah,
shape who we become.
definitely. Definitely, yeah. And most importantly, I think your grandmother was like that too. They had compassion, incredibly compassionate, kind human beings. So that's, I think, compassion, we need to talk about it. It's not a sign of weakness at all. When people show their emotions, it's not, you know, a negative thing at all. And we need to emphasize more maybe the importance of kindness and compassion.
I so agree. I think now, particularly more than ever.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice that you would give to aspiring novelists and writers now?
The only thing I can say is, because this is such a solitary road, in a way, you are alone. I mean, a film director knows how to work with other people, a dancer knows, a choreographer knows, but when you're a novelist, you are on your own for days, weeks, months working. You have to become your best friend and you have to believe in yourself, because believe me, there will be so many people who won't do it. There'll be so many people. If you're a young writer, they will put you down. If you're a woman writer, they will put you down. If you come from a minority background, again, they will, you know, look down upon you. So you're going to go through lots of turbulence anyway. And that's why we have to just shut out all those voices and noises and go within, into our own inner garden. And I think all stories come from that inner garden, and just love what we do. If we love stories, if we believe in stories, that love will help us keep going.
Well, I really appreciate that sentiment, and that reflects in some of your work as well. Elif, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
It was a pleasure for me. You know, I really appreciate it. And hopefully next time under the same roof, we will be speaking face to face.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.